everyone, my name is Sethi. I hope you all are staying healthy. Today we are going to talk about excess and deficient demand with the diagrams. First of all, we will see excess demand. When aggregate demand exceed aggregate supply at full employment level, it will be called excess demand. When aggregate demand exceed aggregate supply at a full employment level, it will be called excess demand. And excess demand creates inflationary gap. Excess demand creates inflationary gap. What do you mean by inflationary gap? Inflationary gap is difference between current demand and demand we need in order to maintain full employment level. Inflationary gap is difference between current demand and demand we need in order to maintain full employment level. Everything we will understand with the help of this diagram. On next axis we have income, output or employment. On y-axis we have aggregate demand. This 45-degree line represents aggregate supply. AD is aggregate demand. E is full employment level because at this point aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Now suppose aggregate supply is constant, only aggregate demand increase. As aggregate demand increase, aggregate demand curve shift forward from AD to AD1. This is our new aggregate demand curve which shows aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply. So it will be called excess demand. And this excess demand create inflationary gap. And inflationary gap is difference between current demand and demand we need in order to maintain full employment level. Here you can see we need only AD demand in order to maintain a full employment level because E is a full employment point. But our current demand is AD1. Difference between AD and AD1 will be called inflationary gap. That means this EF will be called inflationary gap. And this inflationary gap is created by excess demand. Now we are going to talk about deficient demand. When aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply at a full employment level, it will be called deficient demand. When aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply at a full employment level, it will be called deficient demand. And deficient demand create deflationary gap. In this diagram, you can see E is our full employment point because at this point, aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. Now, suppose aggregate supply is constant, only aggregate demand reduce. As aggregate demand reduce, aggregate demand curve shift backward. This one is our new aggregate demand curve which is showing aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. It will be called deficient demand. And this deficient demand create deflationary gap. And deflationary gap is difference between AD1 and AD. Means this difference will be called, this EF difference will be called deflationary gap. Now you see reasons of excess aggregate demand and deficient aggregate demand. As we know, aggregate demand equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Here AD represent aggregate demand. C represent consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditure is spending of household. I represent investment expenditure. Investment expenditure is spending of businesses. G represent government expenditure, and government expenditure is spending of government for welfare of society. X export, M import. When we minus import from export, it will become equal to net export. That means X minus M represent net export. When consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure and net export increase so much, then it will become a reason for excess demand. On the other hand, when consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure or net export reduce so much, then it can become reason for deficient demand. So this is all about excess demand and deficient demand. I think you got it, and thank you so much for watching this video. Bye, take care.